Hey ladies, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Trisha Stefankowitz, registered dietitian and nutritionist. On the episode today, I wanted to talk about this idea of why is it so easy to fall back into like these old behaviors and these old patterns and these old ways of thinking when we may have been doing something different and working really hard on something different. And then all of a sudden we're doing something different and we're behaving in a different way than what is in line with our goals of who we want to be and who we're trying to become and who we're morphing into. I started thinking about this idea because recently my son started kindergarten. And I knew he was, he just was really struggling with the changes. He had a lot of big changes happening. And so at school, he started pooping himself, essentially. And so, this is a kid who doesn't do that. He hasn't done that since he was an infant, or at least potty training. So it happened probably 2 days in a row where at school they just were able to, change his underpants and it was fine. And then on the third day, it was this awful experience for him where he had all this diarrhea and, it happened. He didn't even realize it was happening. And he's doing something that he loves. He's just coloring and it's just coming out. And so they call me and it's so bad that I go to pick him up and he is wearing a trash bag. And I don't know, there's just something. And then the aftermath of all that. So I wasn't sure if something was wrong with him. So we go to the doctors and then essentially what we think it is that he's constipated and that all of that diarrhea that he was having was a result of constipation. If any of you guys or you guys have any kids or anything like that and you struggle with that, there's a really great video that you can Google on YouTube. It's called The Poo in You. The Poo in You. And it basically talks about why diarrhea and constipation are kind of, why they're kind of linked. And so him and I were sitting here watching this video. And so the reason why I tell you this story is that immediately when she kind of says that, it's like this idea that I don't want it to be something more, but that feels more in my control, that he's constipated. And so immediately my brain starts to go into these old behaviors of oh my gosh, I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough as a mom. I should have been more aware of that. I'm a dietitian, for Christ's sake. I know what fiber-rich foods are and just all of these things. And then physical activity has been something that's been my goal that I've been trying to be more consistent on. And so I had, before this started this week, I had already written down what my goals were for the week. And then now that this had happened, the next day, instead of me waking up and exercising, I find myself waking up to, do other things or, other things with my son, making sure that his food is in a certain way and that it's, he's eating fiber-rich foods. Now, I'd already packed his lunch the night before, but now this morning I feel like I have to send a message to his teacher and just all of these things that I'm doing. And and so it started me thinking, what am I doing? This is not in line with what my goals are. And I think probably some of the stuff that I was doing was necessary. I needed to do it. But some of it was also, I think it was very easy for me to fall back into this place and these thoughts of I'm not good enough. I'm going to skip what I believe is going to help me and focus on my son, even though he didn't need anything, because I think it was my own fear and my own anxiety that was kind of taking over, which caused me to then skip doing the very things that were going to probably help manage those things. So I tell you all this story, not to tell you all about my son and his pooping, but to really kind of tell you that, I'm sure that there's times that you felt that way too, that you felt like you were failing in some capacity, that you were really struggling, or that you were putting somebody else's needs before your own. And again, this is my son. He's 5, so it's not like he can really do anything. And so I'm not saying like that I shouldn't put his needs first. Obviously, his immediate needs I can take care of. But for me, I think what I started to notice that it was a way that I was avoiding, or it was a way that I was just like not doing the thing that I needed to do. I could have essentially done, come in the next day and worked out, but it was almost like I was so wrapped up in my angst and my anxiety that I was unable to really think clearly and figure out how to make that happen, if that makes any sense. So perhaps you have found yourself in a position like that too, where you feel like, gosh, I've come so far. I've worked on these behaviors. I worked on these patterns. I worked on these thoughts. And so why is it happening that I'm able to, when I'm stressed, so easily go back into these behaviors? One of the things that I think most people can relate to is this idea that like you're this grown up and you have, you may have a family, or you may have a really well-respected career. And then all of a sudden you go to like your childhood home, or you hang out with your siblings, and you all kind of get back into those old behavior patterns. And you all kind of take your like unassigned roles when you're together, and you can't believe that you're arguing with your sibling about something that wouldn't even matter. But somehow now that you're back into that, you're into that old dynamic that you were doing when you were young. And so it's kind of like in that line. So it started me thinking that, maybe, obviously, I'm not the only one that does that, but I wanted to just kind of talk about it because it's so easy. I find myself when I'm not really in touch with my feelings, or if I'm in a place where I'm really anxious about something, that I have to be very conscious to really practice any of the new behaviors that I've been working on, or it's very easy for me to go back into those old behaviors. So perhaps you are someone that you find yourself, and I'm sure you are, that you found yourself at times in your life when you feel like, gosh, I'm so much further along in my, I thought I was so much further along, and here I am coming back to these old behaviors that I thought I was done with. And so why does this happen? Why are we in a place that we are, going into these old patterns? Well, in the story that I told you, for me, I think I was really scared, and getting back into these old behaviors is something that's a really familiar thing for me. And it's really familiar for me to give up what I'm doing and devote my time to something else. And I feel like as women, maybe you're like that too. Maybe you are in a place that it's much easier for you to care for other people than it is for you to care for yourself. And so typically the reasons why we do that and why we catch ourselves in these old behaviors is because it's a very familiar feeling, right? You've probably practiced some of those old behaviors for a really long time. And so if you're not really paying attention to it, or if something is, you have another thing that is like, that feels like it's more important and that you need to deal with, then it's very easy to probably succumb to that familiarity, no matter how uncomfortable it is. I think it's that familiar feeling. Perhaps you're having these like feelings of being like scared, and you don't really know what to do about something. And what is easier to do is to kind of pick out those old things that you know what to do, right? So for all of you, I know that there are these old patterns that you do, whether they're behaviors, whether they're thoughts, that it's so easy to come and think about. So for me, in that example, it's like, what are you doing? You should know better. Why did you let this happen? Maybe there's also some in there like, you're not good enough, you're not doing good enough as a mom. So perhaps you have something like that too, and that it's very easy for you when you're challenged in some way, whether it be fear or anxiety or stress, that it's very easy for you to fall back into that line of thinking because you've probably thought that much of your life. And maybe this idea of counteracting this idea that you're not good enough is a newer behavior. Maybe it's not practiced enough. So when you're in a time of feeling any of those emotions, the old thoughts and patterns start to come out because it's more practice. You've been doing that. You're much more seasoned at those patterns. And again, when you're feeling all these feelings, it's very easy to fall back into something that you used to do. And it might even be more comfortable. Not in the sense that it's comfortable that you want to keep doing it, but it's comfortable because it's familiar, not that it's actually truly comfortable for you. It's the familiarity and the comfort of it. You may even know that you're doing it, these different things, but you may feel so helpless to do something else. Does any of that feel really familiar to you? Do any of you feel like you've ever found yourself in these patterns, or being unable to, or easily reverting back to old patterns that you've done? It could be for you something that maybe you felt like you were on track and eating a certain way that was in line with your goals. And then all of a sudden you had a stressful event or something that took you out of that. Maybe you felt like you were being really productive in your life. And then all of a sudden you find yourself on the couch watching endless TV, or not doing some of the things in self-care that you previously had been doing. Maybe it's the thoughts, and that you start to say these things to yourself that you've always said to yourself that you've been working on trying to change. All of these may have been old patterns that you used to do that now you find yourself having a hard time doing them. And many times these behaviors are like, they're really subtle. They have these little subtle things that happen first, and you may not even realize that you're in a place that you're distressed, or you're struggling, or you're tired or anxious or scared, or whatever it is that you're feeling. And if it's something really particularly big in your life, it may be really hard for you to kind of get back to a place of where you were. And so when are we most at risk for this happening? When are we most at risk for reverting back to these old behaviors? Well, typically it's going to be when you have some kind of feeling that you feel like that is uncontrollable for you. And you know, that could be that you're scared. That could be because you're anxious. That could be because you're stressed. It could be something that just happens really easily because it's at the end of the day when you're tired and you have less energy to focus on counteracting any of those behaviors, right? So like, if you've all day been really positive and blah, 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 and said all these really great things to yourself, and then all of a sudden you have something that's really stressful that's happening to you, and you know, you're tired, it's going to be very hard for you to then, you know, it may be very hard for you to get the energy to kind of talk yourself out of that. And in the morning, you may be more focused and have more energy than you do at night. So what do you do if you find yourself in this position, as you most definitely will probably at some point? What do you do? Well, I have 3 things that I'm thinking of that you can do to kind of help you get yourself out of this zone and get yourself in a place where you're not hanging out in that place of old patterns that you're trying to change, that you can kind of move yourself a little bit more forward so that you can really, keep practicing the changes that you're really trying to make. The first thing I would say is just to recognize that this is just part of the process. With any change that you're making in any pattern, whether it's your thinking, whether it's your behavior, whether it's your habits, knowing that this is all normal, this is part of the process, that life is messy and imperfect, and that, maybe that old thought and that old behavior is so much stronger that it's a way that you start to recognize these like subtle signals that are heading you into the direction that you're reverting back to those old behaviors or those old patterns, and really, trying to keep practicing the new pattern until you can really feel comfortable enough to replace the old one. And so, maybe that looks like for you, if it's, especially when it's with thoughts. So for me, I'm just giving you examples, but it's a little bit easier for me to recognize some of the thoughts that I have because I go to therapy. So I have somebody who's challenging those thoughts pretty frequently. So chances are for me, if I didn't get right back on track, I would essentially at some point have a therapy appointment that would challenge those thoughts again, right? So for you, it's like this idea of the same thing, that really starting to recognize that this is part of the process and that it will happen until your new pattern is a little bit stronger than the old pattern, and it's totally normal. But kind of having like this way that you can start to recognize any of the subtle signals that may present itself before the actual pattern is completely broken. So for me, again, it's like that there's an end point because I would have a therapy appointment that would help end that. And for you, it's kind of like finding that for yourself. What is it that you can do to kind of like, once you start to figure out like, okay, this is normal, let me just get back on track. Is there something that, that eventually if you decide that it's exercising is one of your things, or if eating differently is one of your things, eventually there becomes a point that you're like, all right, I got to stop. And so, recognizing that there will probably be an endpoint for you. It doesn't mean that that new pattern is completely gone forever. But I think if you're able to normalize it and to just know that that's part of the process and that none of this change is going to be easy, then that's going to make it a lot easier. Which brings me to my second idea of how to kind of get yourself back on track. So the first is to know that life is messy and imperfect and that this is completely normal, that it's going to happen. That's the number one thing to get you back into the way that you want to and the behavior that you want to feel, and that's going to be your new habit. And the second thing is to give yourself grace and just to get back into the ritual of what you were doing. So James Clear has this book, Atomic Habits, which I don't know if any of you have read, but if you're in a place that you're looking to change patterns or to change behavior, that maybe even change, something when it comes to your health, he has this book about how to make that happen. It's a great book. And so he basically talks about this idea of rituals, and that really what is going to be really important is that you keep practicing these behaviors until it becomes a habit. So those old thoughts and those old patterns of the way that you used to be, that maybe you don't want to be anymore, or you want to act a little differently, the reason why you're so good at them is because it required so much repetition in order for that to happen. And so if you're doing something or you have thoughts about yourself that you've been doing for 40 years, you have 40 years of repetition to make that make that thought be something that feels real and that feels like, that you're really good at it. And so it's kind of the same thing, that if you are in a place that you find yourself doing these old patterns, that you then get back into the ritual of what the new pattern is that you're trying to do and keep repeating it. Because basically the only way that you're going to get good at continuing to do the good habit that you want to change, the only way you're going to get good at that and to have it be better than the old pattern is if you repeat it. And so I would say to get back up and start doing the behavior that you desire and just keep doing it with repetition. And that's what he talks about, that precise behavior becomes a habit the more you practice it, the more you repeat it. So get back on track and, just kind of start to challenge any of those old thoughts that you have, perhaps like you've been more recently doing. Or if it's that you feel like you've gotten off track with how you're eating, just start again. You don't have to wait. You don't have to beat yourself up because it wasn't perfect. Know that it's normal. This is part of the process. And get yourself back into that you're doing that behavior, because this will start. The more you practice it, the more you repeat the behavior, this will help make that behavior become automatic. It's not going to become automatic unless you have the repetition with it. And so the more you repeat it, the more it becomes automatic, the more it will become a habit for you. And also there's some talk too that the more often you do that behavior that you want, the more self-control you will develop to keep you doing the desired thing. So, if you find yourself that you're in a place with my son, so I'm in a place that I'm saying to myself, oh, you're not good enough. You somehow failed yourself. Well, that's a really old thought for me. So then for me, it's coming back and being like, okay, you are good enough. It doesn't have any reflection on you or it's like that's just like a silly thought. But I have to keep challenging that thought every time it comes up, or that I'm aware of it, so that I can get into a place that it becomes habit, that new thought becomes habit. Because the more I repeat the new thought, the more automatic it's going to be, the more of a habit it's going to do. And, the more often I do that and say something different to myself, the more self-control I'm going to have, that I'm going to be able to do that easier, and that it will hopefully at some point replace any of these old thoughts that we have. And so the more you do it, the more, the easier it's going to become. It's going to be more familiar, just like any of those old patterns that you may be doing. And remember that you are fighting against this dopamine hit of pleasure. So for most people, when you fall back into those old patterns, whatever it is, that there's kind of this pleasure, I think. And it's this weird thing because it may not feel pleasurable, but I think that dopamine hit comes from there's something in it that you're getting from it, or whether it's that comfort or that familiarity, but there's something that you're finding comfort and pleasure in. And so you're kind of a little bit fighting against that. So so that's why it's really important to just kind of get back into the ritual of what it is that you're doing to change that behavior, and then just repeating that behavior with repetition until it becomes a habit. And then the last thing I would say to do would be to have a no judgment zone about anything that you thought or that you felt like you did. For most people, it ends up being this idea of I can't believe I did that. Why did I do that? We beat ourselves up. And what that ends up doing is it keeps us in that pattern that we don't want to do for a longer period of time. And if we stay there, and the longer we stay there, it's going to be really hard to move forward with the new pattern. I think it's very easy for a lot of women to stay in that place where we're judging ourselves, because we're comparing ourselves to other people, and that might be a really familiar feeling, and it might even actually be some weirdly comfortable feeling that you're beating yourself up and you're judging yourself. But what happens is that it's very hard to then move forward with the new pattern that you're trying to create because you're staying so long in this zone. And so it's just this idea of like picking yourself up, not judging it, and just getting back into the behavior that you're trying to practice. No judgment. Okay, so these are the 3 things that I would say that if you're in a place that you are finding yourself getting or slipping back into old patterns, really starting to kind of think about what's going on. The first is knowing that life is messy and imperfect and that it's just part of the process. The second is to give yourself grace and to get back into the routine so that get back into the routine that you're trying to continue with, not to the old habit, to the new habit, and practicing it enough that it becomes a habit because of the sheer thought that you're doing it and it's becoming repetition, so that's automatic in your life. The third is having a judgment-free zone, not beating yourself up because you don't want to stay in that zone for a long period of time because it's going to be really hard for you to get to a place that you can move forward. And one other thing that I wanted to mention about this and being in this judgment-free zone, I think it's really important that you understand that this is part of the process in the sense that it's not like all of a sudden you change a pattern of being and it just stays like that forever. It doesn't. And I think that when you have these times, it's almost like this idea of failed dieting, right? You almost need to have these times that you fail so that you can start to see the things that work for you and the things that don't work for you. And in patterns, it's the same way. So being in a place that you fall back into old patterns, it really helps you identify some of the really subtle things that are happening along the way so that the next time it happens, maybe it's easier for you to identify what it is you're doing. And so then the next time it happens after that, because it ultimately will keep happening until it becomes more automatic for you to do that new behavior. And so maybe like each time you fall back into that old rut or that old behavior that you're trying to change, maybe each time along the way, you find these little subtle nuances of the way you start to, think about things. And once you start to recognize what some of those nuances are, then you can change them so that you can get better at that new habit that you're trying to do. So there's a lot of things that can be gained from that. And if we're always looking at it as some way that we've failed or that we've reverted back into these old behaviors, it kind of takes away from the growth that is happening each time that we're falling back in these old behaviors. So say, we can use the example of when you are with your family and you revert back into these old behaviors because it's so easy to do. But say then the next time you start to see, okay, like you leave your family's house and you are kind of in your head thinking about the event, right? And you kind of start to see like, okay, this person triggered me. Well, then the next time when you go home and you're in that same situation, you may have a little bit more of an understanding like, oh, this person triggered me. Let me be more wary of that. Right? So then you do that every time you go home or you're in that situation. And then the more you practice that, the more that behavior will change and it will be more positive because you're kind of paying attention to it, right? And so it's kind of the same thing here. The more you revert back into these old patterns, you're going to learn a whole bunch of information that then you can take into the next time you feel like you're in a place that you're reverting back into these old behaviors, and you can glean some kind of knowledge from it so that you can really start to perfect the new behavior that you're trying to do. So I hope that you all are having a really great day. And I hope that if you find yourself in a place that you are reverting back to old habits, that this brings you some comfort that you are first not alone. I'm right there with you. And, I'm still processing all that I've been going through. But certainly I felt like if I'm experiencing this, perhaps you are too. And just in general, you're not alone. I mean, you're doing something that is really hard in terms of changing a behavior. And I just wanted to remind you that it's not always comfortable. And there is a lot of, comfort sometimes in these old behaviors, whether or not they actually feel comfortable. It's something that is comfortable in the sense that we know it because we've been doing it for so long. And that, if you find yourself doing these old behaviors, that it is part of the process, and just to kind of get back into the new behavior and give yourself some grace, and just to get out of that zone where you're punishing yourself a little bit sooner rather than later. So I hope you all have a really great week, and I will see you guys back here next week. You can please, if you found value in this podcast and you think someone would benefit from it, please feel free to share this podcast with them so that maybe they can find the same comfort in this idea that normalizing the things that happen in the behavior change process will be a way that you can get to actually achieve the things that you're trying to achieve in the long run. So I'll see you guys back here next week, and I hope you have a great week.